Decentralization is all the rage these days. We talk about DeFi or decentralized financial systems, distributed data, Web3, and reinventing the internet. Today, we're going to be taking a look at what the future might look like because it's closer than you think. So stay tuned. Hey everybody, this is Chris Brandt with Sandesh Patel. Welcome to another FUTRtech video podcast. Today, we have brought back Dr. Colleen Tartow, renowned astrophysicist turned data scientist who is the director of engineering at Starburst Data, and future first-timer Annika Lewis, who has a background in finance and venture capital and is now with Gitcoin, a community for developers to collaborate and monetize their skills while working on open source projects with bounties. Today, they're going to tell us about the rise of the data mesh, Web3, crypto, and the brave new world that we are hurtling towards. Welcome, Colleen and Annika.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Well, thanks for being on. This is exciting stuff. Let me put my glasses on so I can really see what's going on here. So, before we get into everything, could you guys tell us the story about how you guys came together?
Yeah, so Colleen and I met probably about a year and a half ago now through a women's speaker boot camp called Shine Boot Camp. And it was this boot camp where everyone had a topic to pick, and everyone picked all these really cool, creative, artsy topics that were very trendy. And Colleen and I were both talking about data. So we became fast friends, being the two nerds in the room, and the rest is history. United
by data. That's a lovely story.
And in the time since, we've actually we started a newsletter together called The Sequel, where we talk about the human side of data, and we just kind of nerd out for whoever's listening out there on the internet.
So I know, Annika, you've got kind of more of a finance background. Colleen, you kind of come more from the data sciences side of the world. And there's a big movement around decentralization on both of those fronts. And when we start looking at what everybody is calling Web3, decentralization is sort of central to that. I guess that's a very, very bad dad joke there. But can you tell me, like, from a data perspective, from a financial perspective, from a Web3 perspective, what is this decentralization movement?
I do see decentralization happening at a lot of different places in society, and it's this idea of democratization of resources. An example I gave my husband the other day was actually streaming video. And you can think of the centralized cable provider as like a one-stop shop for shows and movies. And that's cool, but it's also really expensive, and you typically don't want everything you get there. And then on the other hand, now we have this capability that's, wasn't there 20 years ago, but now it's all about streaming, and it's changed the way that we consume, entertainment. And it's really decentralizing it and taking away that requirement for that central provider, because you just pick the networks and the services that you want. You can say, I only want Netflix, or I only want, Netflix, Hulu, and HBO. And you can get that at a fraction of the price. So it really allows the consumer to streamline their experience. And so that's just one example, but I do see it happening in a lot of different places.
Internet Web 1 was, supposed to be decentralized. It's decentralized, designed to survive a nuclear attack. There's nobody owns it. But here we are, talking about decentralization again. And I know the pendulum is constantly swinging. Why do you guys think this is all happening now?
I think a lot of it is just pushback from current structures and kind of a big cultural movement. We've been living in an environment over the last, 10, 20 plus years whereby the large corporations and the large governments are those who have the power. And you've got, 20% of the people at most holding 80% of the power, and kind of a desire to shift that and to have more collectively driven systems, organizations, even technology. I think overall it's just kind of a reaction to the systems that we've been living in that have become increasingly centralized, and a desire to move away from that and to bring more power, more autonomy to the individual.
And so you have people like the founder of Twitter who's saying that all great, but now the VCs are just going to own that now too. What would you say to that sort of rhetoric?
Yeah, I would say I think things are changing in Web3. I think in particular the idea of tokenization and enabling kind of collective ownership, not just of investors, but of participants. So people actually being paid in equity for their contributions and being valued as owners from day one of contributing, as opposed to just being valued as a worker or kind of a contractual employee. I think we're already coming to a world where people are demanding more of that. And so, yes, there will continue to be VCs, there will continue to be investors, but I think a lot of the structures, the levels of ownership and kind of the power dynamics are starting to change there already with what I'm seeing happening on the Web3 side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think something certainly needs to change, because it seems like, our systems are breaking, clearly. I mean, we've had a lot of issues in the last, several years, and there's currently a war in Europe going on, and just a lot of our traditional systems are kind of flying apart at the seams. So, Colleen, you're on the data side of this, and I know that one of the big things that is part of this too is that sort of the democratization of data as well, right? I mean, we have these silos, these islands of data all over the place, but they could have wider benefit. Could you talk to what happens to data on that front?
Let's step back in time when hardware was in data centers and the cloud was just condensation in the sky. And back then, hardware was your limitation. You had databases and hardware that were all finely tuned towards that transactional use case. And if you wanted to do any analytics on your data, you had to build a data pipeline and move it elsewhere and put it on hardware that was specially tuned for analytics. And in that world, it makes a lot of sense to just pipe all your data to the same place and have a centralized location that is your data store and curate it either in flight or at the target location. But the challenge with that is that as organizations grow and scale, it's hard to scale a centralized data architecture, and it's even harder to scale a centralized data organization, and you end up with a lot of bottlenecks. And so I think people are really starting to question that they're not able to realize the value of their data because they feel behind and they know they're missing out on data strategy. So today in 2022, we have this magical thing called the cloud, and we have really awesome modern databases and open source and commercial data software and managed services, and we're just not limited by hardware in the same way. But despite these, modern conveniences and technologies, we're still using this old paradigm of piping the data around and trying to get back to that centralized location. So the next thing is, okay, that centralized strategy isn't working. What do we try next? Decentralization. So I think people are getting to that point.
So I know you've been talking about the concept of the data mesh. Mm-hmm. What is the data mesh?
Yes. So data mesh is a framework that takes modern data management and modern data organizations, and it tries to articulate and be a bit prescriptive about how to approach decentralization. And it's based on 4 pillars, and it can be quite theoretical, but it also actually works in practice, which is nice. And it has these 4 pillars that describe how you should treat data as a first-class product, how you can avoid bottlenecks, how you can handle governance, do things like creating a self-service infrastructure. And its founder articulates it as a socio-technical solution because it addresses not just the actual architecture and the ownership and decentralization of those, but also the organization of the humans who handle the data and how you decentralize them. And so if you're a data nerd or you follow data Twitter, you've probably heard a lot about data mesh in the last year or two, but that's really it in a nutshell. It's, like I said, it can be an academic pursuit, but a lot of people are in the midst of implementing it. And personally, I'm excited about it because it solves a lot of the challenges that I've personally experienced when we try to have this holy grail of the central data repository.
I know one of the things that's always a big issue in the data side of the world is sort of the concept of data gravity, and moving that data, like you were mentioning earlier, moving that data around gets so complicated. I mean, I could see a big advantage in sort of decentralized data where, you don't necessarily have to move it all the time. You can kind of just have access to large pools of data without, moving it.
Yep. And also just making available what the end user needs, right? Like curating it as a product for the end user. That's really the key there is That's something that is challenging to do when your focus is on moving the data as opposed to curating the data. So really, it's about creating data products, like treating data as a first-class citizen within the organization.
Okay, so now we understand what the data mesh is. now, Annika, if you could explain to us what Web3 is.
Yeah, so Web3 is a term that is being used to kind of talk about the next generation of the internet, and it's an internet that is largely underpinned by blockchains and by crypto infrastructures. So you've almost seen folks kind of move from talking about the crypto industry to now the Web3 industry. So you can think of them as overlapping, if not close to analogous. But in terms of kind of the context of the history of the internet, we think about it in terms of kind of read, write, and own. So if Web 1, which is kind of the 1990s, early 2000s, was just the read sort of iteration of the internet, whereby you would have all of these static, HTML websites, and you could go in and you could see information, which at the time was super novel and fascinating and a groundbreaking, innovation. But that was, kind of what you primarily did on the internet was go and find information and read. There was then Web 2, which is kind of the early 2000s till probably early 2010s, around kind of the right internet. So that was when, we started interacting with social media applications and starting to, put our own information on the internet and host profiles and, buy things and all of that. And then the idea of sort of Web 3 from an own perspective is, both to have that read and that write functionality, but also via tokenization, via other mechanisms, be able to actually participate as owners in the structure of the internet, which now, underpins the whole economy and we know is, a massive part of our lives and will be an increasingly large part of our lives with, the advent of the metaverse and all of that. For many of us, our lives are effectively online now. I work at a company that is completely remote. Everyone's all over the world. In some ways, it feels weirdly like my real life is more online than it is offline, which is crazy and terrifying in many ways. But Web3 is kind of the articulation of the next generation of what all of that will look like when the internet is underpinned by blockchains.
When would someone that has no idea that the Web3 is coming and what it even is, how is it going to impact like the normal human being? And when when will they be like, oh, that's what Web3 is, and they actually will be able to see it?
This is such a great question. And I love this because I work in Web3. I talk about Web3 all the time, but my friends and family in the real world are like, why is this applicable to me? How is this applicable to me? What should I be doing? So I love this question. I think for me, how we'll know Web3 has arrived is when you are using blockchain-based applications and you don't even know it. You're just using them because they are the best applications and because they're the types of software you want to be using. I think in many ways that may come through entertainment type stuff, like when you're playing a video game and then you find out later that it was perhaps blockchain-based. Maybe it'll come through financial systems, though I feel like that's not likely. And even if you look at the last year, most people have been onboarded into Web3 really because of NFTs and because of feeling like an emotional attachment to a JPEG, which, is weirdly just a much more powerful emotional way to get people using something rather than saying, hey, check out this new DeFi lending protocol. Like nobody wants to be banking all the time for fun, at least nobody other than me, because I'm crazy. But yeah, to me, I think it's, the technology and the user experience getting to a level where it just is ubiquitous and where you don't even notice that it's there. I think we're still a ways away from that. But I think for me, that'll be how we actually ultimately get people onboarded rather than trying to kind of spoon feed the world into something that maybe isn't ready or isn't relevant for them just yet.
I think there's a lot of people don't really understand it, right? Because you talk about Web3 all the time, Chris, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't know what you're talking about when you bring it up.
I'm not sure I know what I'm talking about.
So I think there's a comfort gap and an education gap, and because of that, it leads people to sometimes more of the negative sides of that. You know what I mean? Because they don't understand it.
The brave new world is here, and I think that there's a whole generation that's just 100% ready for it, which is amazing. And I think that's a piece that people sometimes miss when we start talking about these things. It's not this isn't targeted for my generation necessarily. It's targeted for the generation that's going to be ultimately the main consumer of this when it, kind of hits maturity, right?
Yeah, it's already incredible to see, in the Web3 space, how many of these, open source developers and people who are, building these real large scale companies who are like 16 years old. It's possible in this brave new world that we live in, and it totally shifts, how we think about work, frankly. The future of work changes, how we define work, at what age we might start, working. It's all a new ball game in this era.
One of the things that you were talking about in the Web3 space is sort of that the own part, right? And who owns these things, and ultimately it's who owns the data, right? And Colleen, when you were looking at like the data mesh, certainly having resources available to everybody on the cloud, those become not just proprietary things that are used for internal business intelligence, but maybe, top line sort of products in and of themselves, right? And then you take that and you combine it with the concept of crypto and, the ownership part of it and the ability to sort of like dole it out in ways that you want. It seems like the control of that data, there's a greater level of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I would love to hear it. I feel like there's a whole lot to say about data in Web3 because it really is the basis of Web3 in a way that Web 1 and Web 2 it's not. I think a lot of this data world that corporations are dealing with right now is like Web 2 based data, right? It's the Web 2 model of the world, whereas the Web 3 model of the world, the data itself is democratized as the blockchain democratizes it. I don't know if that phrasing is right. I'm not in the Web3 world the way Annika is, but
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And this is part of my big excitement around Web3 is kind of the democratization of data. And how I describe it is sort of the decoupling of the application layer and the data layer. And if you think about, the last 10 years in your companies like, Facebook, Netflix, et cetera, they have both the application layer and the data layer. They have built these applications and then you as a user feed all of your data into it and they own everything and they can repackage that data and sell it and use it as they see fit. And that's how they've become these absolute behemoths. In Web3, with how things are architected, it's just done differently. So you've got these sort of data protocols that are kind of at the most base layer. And then you have people building applications that then sort of feed in data from these different protocols. And what it enables is just a much more sort of user-driven kind of access control to data. If I had $1 for every company I saw in the last kind of 10 years that was trying to, bring you back ownership of your data, I would have a lot of dollars because a lot of people tried to do this in Web 2. And frankly, it just didn't really work because of how the systems and how software were built. And so, it was really, really hard to try and take the value back from the likes of Facebook. But with Web3 and how these things are being built, and you've got awesome protocols like Ceramic Protocol is a great example of one that I think is going to be instrumental in this space. I think it is going to really make us rethink business models, rethink, even revenue and how revenue generation happens, and ownership of our own data, and have a lot more sort of authority and autonomy over that. And that's my hope for Web3.
It's interesting. I mean, I love the concept of like owning my own data and having the rights to like know who's using it and what they're using it for. But I don't, I worry about, like when we started having the GDPR regulations, for example, people had to be notified that, you're collecting cookie data and things like that on them. And then we got into this habit of like every single, website has this pop-up, agree to my cookies, agree to this, agree to that. It's like, and it feels like, a couple things. One, it's like one, I get a notification, but I get so many of those notifications that sort of have become meaningless. But two, it also promotes this sort of bad behavior of clicking on buttons on random websites on the internet, which is an extraordinarily bad thing. So I mean, like, I think it's challenging in the sense that like, how do we get past some of the bad intentions perhaps of a lot of companies and their desire to constantly collect this data? I mean, because we're still going to have to go and shop and do things like that. I mean, do you envision like the Web3 piece of it and your data as being like having an abstraction layer that sits between you and the internet that, sort of proxies the appropriate amount of data to everybody? Or how would all that work?
Yeah, I would like to hear Colleen's thoughts too, but I'm still a little bit murky on, frankly, like what exactly the UI looks like and how it plays out.
Yeah.
But just what I know fundamentally in terms of like how these protocols and systems are being built, I feel like I see the glimmers of that separation being doable and viable in a way that it wasn't viable in the Web 2 world. So I don't know what it will actually look like to you or me as a consumer. Like, yeah, maybe it will look like, authenticating differently on certain sites, and hopefully it doesn't look like closing a ton of cookies buttons like we all do on every website we go to. But just in terms of, like first principles, kind of from the ground up, like how this is being built, I do think it will look very different. And I do think the Facebooks of the world will hopefully need to rethink, kind of how they're using data to monetize in the new world.
Well, and they certainly suffered, greatly in their collection efforts when Apple changed some of the policies on iOS. I mean, so there's certainly a precedent there for how some of that can work, and Apple's right now doing a lot of data abstraction. So like when you order things, you can use a temporary email address, you can use a temporary credit card number. So I mean, there are some models for that level of abstraction that can sit between you and some of these companies, and I guess that's what Web3 is looking like, at the beginning.
Yeah, I definitely think we're going to see a lot of companies having to rethink their revenue models, not just the Facebooks, but I think like you said, you click that cookie button on almost every site, right? Like, you're being tracked everywhere. And like, most people just click it, right? And like you said, it's bad behavior, but we have to do it if we want to live our lives online. So the question is from an experience standpoint, like I love that Apple capability where you can be like, use a temporary login and mask my email address. That's fantastic. But is that going to be the new clicking on everything, right? Like,
well, and at the end of the day, Apple has all that information.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
And Apple still has the information. So I'm curious, like, what's the next step there? And so I do see us, I'm curious what the timeline on Web3 is too, because I do think that, there is a balance. Centralization isn't always bad, right? Like it's not always the worst thing ever. Like, we live in a federated society and a lot of things are federated where there's a share of balance between a centralized thing and a decentralized thing, whatever it is. And so I do think that, there's a moderation that is sort of the pendulum swinging and eventually it kind of stops in the middle, right? Like that's the idea. And so, maybe we're still on the big swings at the beginning and then we'll sort of land in the middle, just to super kill that analogy, Chris.
And Annika, I mean, you are definitely in the financial side. You play in the VC side of the house and all that. And so, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the enormous amount of money going into to Web3 and crypto and all that, right? I mean, so there's a lot of people who are betting quite heavily on it, right? And I think they're going in, and there's a lot of different directions that they're going on. What are you seeing on that front?
Yeah, it's the Wild West right now. It feels like in the last year or so, a ton of people, myself included, frankly, have woken up to the power of Web3 and what it is likely to become, and investors are definitely no exception. So, yeah, certainly seeing a lot more kind of mainstream investor interest. I think initially, you sort of saw most of the same names around the table, sort of the OG kind of crypto funds that were very Web3 native to begin with. Now you're seeing sort of all sorts of both corporates as well as institutional venture funds that just haven't been focused on Web3, trying to dip into the space. And it's interesting now seeing it from the other side of the table, now that I'm more on the operating side in Web3, just seeing the dynamics of venture fundraisers and how they're changing. You can look at the Sushi Swap raise from last summer, where you can read this whole governance forum back and forth between the venture capitalists and the community of this project, kind of debating what the terms of a round would be in public. You've got, other projects like Friends with Benefits, where you had, venture capitalists come onto a call and pitch the community as to why the community should take their money. So it's really shifting, the dynamics of power, just the dynamics of fundraising, which have always happened very behind closed doors, and making them a lot more in public and community driven. So yeah, venture is changing very quickly, and it's really interesting to be watching right now.
Well, I think the interesting thing here that is so powerful about this concept is it offers a different way to monetize the internet. And, like historically, the primary way of monetizing like content, for example, is advertising. And advertising has this very dark side, right? I mean, advertising really creates perverse incentives. It promotes cultures of consumerism. I mean, there's a lot of downsides to financing something as important and significant as the internet purely on ad revenue.
The idea of Web3, my understanding, is that people will be able to speak with their dollars in a way that they can't now, or their coin.
Yeah.
And, they'll be able to target where their money is going in a more intentional and thoughtful way. Right. They'll be able to say, like, I want to subscribe to this newsletter and I will pay for it, as opposed to just relying on ad revenue. And so people, I hope it promotes intentionality around our use of the internet.
Well, and just some sort of, ability to integrate, microtransactions as a, fundamental underlying layer to all this would be really nice. If, Annika, if you could just get that into the list of things that I want for Web3.
Yes, the financialization of everything. That's definitely a theme.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's it is the backbone of everything, at the end of the day. And, like having a good way to allow people to, make an income and survive on the content and the goods and services that they produce in a way that, works for everyone is a huge thing. And then keep that secure and safe too.
Yeah, and I think this is actually an interesting moment for me to kind of mention Gitcoin, which is the project that I currently work with, because it is exactly what you're saying, right? So at Gitcoin, our mission is to build and fund public goods. And we started public goods being in the context of open source software, mainly in the Ethereum ecosystem. But kind of the thesis we have, and I know I've spoken with Colleen about this before, is open source is just such a value add to the internet, to developers, to data scientists, to everyone technical kind of all over the world. It generates billions and billions of dollars in economic value each year. But in the Web2 systems, there wasn't really a way for open source developers to monetize their open source work. It was, largely something they did side of desk. And so often projects ended up going unmaintained, even if they were, critical infrastructure that folks would build on top of, just because these developers couldn't get paid. So what we've tried to do is try to build a system that treats open source software as public goods, like as a good that should be, funded by the public, like how you fund things with your tax dollars, and trying to fund them in a much more democratic way. And so that's basically what we're focused on, is trying to create ways for builders of public goods to be able to get funded, and for people to be able to vote with their dollars and kind of distribute these wealth mechanisms in a way that hasn't been done before. So I think, Gitcoin is just one example of that in Web3, but I think just kind of the fundamental redistribution of value and putting value towards things where there's clearly value, but Web2 hasn't perhaps attributed it there.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, because I see that all the time. I mean, it's not just, certainly coders, I think, there's been a huge amount of just taking advantage of open source projects. Mm-hmm. And you see that constantly where, people are using code, not contributing back, not following the terms of the licensing agreements for that. Mm-hmm. And just like taking some of that edge off by having a way to, supplement your income with that, and like you said, some of these projects are extraordinarily important. I mean, they're like literally, underpinning everything we do every day. And you've got, like maybe one or two, guys who are, coding this thing and maintaining it. And it's like, wow, really? That's what it is. It's scary when you think about that.
Yeah. I will also say that studies have shown that the maintainers and coders who are creating open source projects, it's actually pretty biased, because there aren't a lot of women who do open source. It's pretty closed down to women, just for societal reasons that, I could talk about for another hour. But
well, I mean, there's definitely some very toxic culture out there
and so
on that front.
Open source does tend to be like a very demographically static group of folks, because they're not able to see financial incentives. So I do hope that the Web3 aspect of this is able to remove some of that bias as well. Like I definitely can see how that would happen through the financialization of open source in this way.
Yeah, I think that would be amazing because like I do see what happens in sort of that coding side of it, and it can get toxic really fast. I mean, it's all that the Gamergate stuff, like kind of leaks through, which is obviously not a friendly place. So like Colleen, you're working for Starburst, and I know that you guys have been doing something interesting on the data mesh side of things too, right?
So we've really doubled down on this idea of data as a first-class citizen, data as a product. And my team over the past few months has come up with an actual user interface that allows people to use Starburst to create data products. So the idea is that data engineers in a decentralized or centralized, but mostly we're aiming at the decentralized use case, engineers within a domain can use Starburst and use our web interface to actually just create data products, and we're not requiring you to pipe data around. You're using the Starburst, power and performance and security and all that, and you're able to create these data products. And then there's a consumer interface as well, where consumers can come in and discover data and see it, and it's secured and all that. So it's really it's kind of the first product of its kind, which is really exciting. So that's sort of our new thing, which is very exciting, and it came out at just came out a few weeks ago.
I think that's interesting. And we were talking, Sandesh and I were interviewing with FUTRtech. I don't know if you're familiar with that company, but they offer a confidential computing platform. The thing that's interesting about it that we got into this conversation about, and we talked about, data mesh, was the concept of that, like being able to encrypt data in a way that you can share it, but at any time revoke that ability to share or use that data, and having sort of like centralized mechanisms by which to do that. And I think that sort of ties these worlds together, where you've like got your data out there publicly available, maybe even like shared, but cryptographically secured, so you still retain the ownership of that data, right?
Right.
But you're still sharing that data. And we have the world of like the homomorphic encryption and things like that, where you could manipulate metadata without actually having access to the data and things like that. I think that's a long way off. And like having the ability to sort of just ultimately what people want is the ability to control this data, right? And who has access to it, when and where.
Yeah, governance is a challenge. I mean, it's been a challenge since the inception of data warehouses, right? Like allowing the right people and only the right people access to the data that they need to make insights, but not hindering them from making insights because you're locking things down too much. And it's just this idea of federated governance is really key to data mesh. And I really think that it's admitting that there is no one size fits all solution, but that here organizationally is how you do that, right? And it sort of again gets back to that socio-technical aspect of it, that there's a sociological aspect where you have to have the people understand that they're, the teams that are creating the data are controlling certain aspects of the data, like adhering to entity standards, but then the entity standards are defined at the federated level, right? So like you've got sort of this spectrum of governance where some things are handled purely at the organizational level and some are handled by the teams. And you just have to have an agreement, and really then taking it one step further, making it programmatic and computational, and treating governance as code is really the holy grail, because then you can do those things like locking data down when you need to, that kind of thing.
And that sounds very Web3 to me.
It sounds so Web3. Just hearing you talk about, federated governance and all of that is, it's fascinating. The parallels here are just incredible. It is all part of the broader decentralization trend, but, with how we're thinking about, even sort of corporate governance in Web3, and that being sort of, federated across not just kind of all, owners of the organization, but all contributors within an organization. Yeah, it's just fascinating. There's so many parallels.
Wait, do I work in Web3 and I didn't know it? Cool.
You're building Web3 right now,
resume.
and you didn't know it. End of the day, I think the thing that's cool about what I look forward to in Web3, right, is the web that we currently, the internet, because it's bigger than the web, right? It's the whole internet that we currently have built for ourselves, wasn't built with some of the appropriate underlying security protocols and thoughts towards privacy and things like that are so important to us now, right? And so by adding in the cryptographic piece of it, the sort of the more distributed ledger aspect of the blockchain, being able to both at the same time secure yourself, your possessions, your data, your information, all those things, while at the same time being able to provide like a base level of abstraction into what you're doing, and at the same time, I think with the metaverse, when we've got the metaverse coming on, it's not going to happen as one unified platform. It's going to be lots of pockets of metaverse all around the internet, and being able to bring virtual possessions from one place to another and have them there and have them functional and useful and maintaining like sort of a consistent value to them across places is going to be extremely valuable. And I that's where I see how most people are going to enjoy it. Just better portability, better scalability, better control of their privacy, and more secure financial transactions. That to me is sort of the platonic ideal of Web3.
Yeah, I agree with that. We've got work to do in getting there, but definitely aligned with you on the vision.
So if you guys had any advice for people, looking to Web3, what jobs should they be looking at? What should they be investing in?
This idea of decentralization it's just a really interesting axis on which to evaluate things, whether it's government or currency or the internet or data or streaming services or anything we've mentioned. And it's one of those things that once I started to notice it's everywhere. But for me, like most things in life, like I said, balance is key. And so I think it depends, right now, I think there's probably more risk in Web3 than there will be 5 years from now, right? Like, I think it'll be a very different world 5 years from now. And so, if you want to dip your toe in, I think there are ways to do that. And it's kind of, I think it'll become more and more common, especially, I think we'll ramp up quickly.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, to me, it's about, getting involved in a way that feels organic to you, in a way that makes sense. Not everyone's interested in being an investor. Not everyone's interested in NFTs. Some folks might be more interested in DAOs and the concept of decentralized work and starting to engage there. So I think figuring out what piques your interest and just starting to dive in there, it's like saying, how to get involved with the internet in, the 1980s. And so it's like, where do you even start? There's so many potential angles. So I think just, keeping a pulse on it and diving in and starting, the conversations in areas that you find most interesting.
Yeah, well, I think it's all very cool stuff, and I just really appreciate you guys coming on and talking about it and sharing your expertise with us, because I think this is this is one of those areas is it's still a little abstract because it's still being built, right? And nobody really knows what it's ultimately going to look like, right? And it's kind of exciting stuff. This is get in on the ground floor. Become a data scientist, become a a cryptographer, I guess that's where to invest your time, right? Well, so thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll have you back on again to talk about this as it progresses, because I think there's going to be a lot more discussions to be had on this.
Yeah, thanks very much. This was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for watching. Love to hear from you in the comments, and if you like what you saw, give us a like and think about subscribing. That subscription helps the channel a ton and really appreciate it. And I will see you in the next video.